Hey everyone. So, in the process of making my LG V60 review video, as many of you have probably heard by now, LG is thinking about getting out of the smartphone business. Please, LG, say it isn't so. You need to stick around and give Samsung, Huawei, Oppo, OnePlus, and others competition. I mean, Sony isn't doing too well in their smartphone division, also, but they're sticking around. So you should too, LG. Don't give up on us, and we won't give up on you. This is going to be part one of a two-part full-length feature film movie documentary, if you will. I didn't realize that when I briefly started talking about all the phones in this video that it would end up becoming this long. Anyways, please like and subscribe and hit the bell notification so you guys won't miss part two coming out really soon. And I will put links in the description for a section that you are most interested in. Enjoy the video, everybody, and have an awesome day. But before we get into the video on the history of LG phones, I wanted to put my own 2 cents into why I think LG's sales aren't really doing too well in their smartphone business, and it's all because of LG. Number one, marketing, 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 marketing. When was the last time have any of you guys ever seen a commercial for LG smartphones? Anybody? I haven't seen one, and that was just in the last year, not to mention the past few years. I've seen a bunch of commercials on their TVs, and really that's what mostly people talk about is LG's OLED displays, OLED TVs, and their OLED technology, see-through OLED displays, their new rollable phone coming out, hopefully. But LG never talks about their smartphones or have any commercials on their smartphones. I mean, I even walked into a T-Mobile store, and most of the employees there didn't even know they had an LG V60 when I was interested in getting this V60 phone. So that's their main, I think, problem is they don't market their phones well enough as good as they do with their TVs. And then the second thing is the support. They're still very slow on their software updates compared to, like, say, even Samsung is getting better with their updates. On my Note 10 Plus, I just received another update for my Samsung, more security patches for this year, January 2021. My security patch for my V60 is still, I think, in November of 2019. Although I heard that LG is rolling out releases for Android 11 starting today, I guess, January 24th. Back in early 2018, LG's new president, or their new president of their mobile or electronics division, was saying that they were going to market their phones more and they were going to go back to the basics, which they called the ABCD, which was audio, battery, camera, and display. And some of that stuff they delivered. They still have the headphone jack, that's for audio, with their 32-bit quad DAC. Their battery life is getting better with bigger batteries. Their cameras are improving, and their displays with their POLED displays are getting better. But does anybody even know about them? No. And that, again, all comes down to marketing. So that's just my 2 cents. If you guys want to maybe get in more in depth about like why LG might be failing, I have some suggestions for other channels in the description down below, so please check those out. But now let's get started on a brief timeline of LG's featured phones and their Android smartphones. Before we begin, I want to just give a big thanks to gsmarena.com for their article on An abridged history of LG phones. I will put that article in the link down below, which was a lot of help in making this video. So thank you, GSM Arena. So let's begin. LG has been making phones or mobile phones since 2002, and those were the early flip phones, but we're not going to talk about those as there weren't any significant first or innovations on LG on those phones. And they've also made Windows phones, so we won't be talking about those also, because those LG Windows phones got about as much attention from LG as they're going to get as much attention from us today, which is almost zero. And actually, one of my first ever mobile phone was an LG flip phone from Verizon. But like I said, we won't be talking about those. We're only going to talk about LG's feature phones and their Android smartphones and some of the first and innovations that they brought into the smartphone or mobile phone industry. Let's start with the LG Chocolate, which was released in March of 2006. It was one of LG's first feature phones, and also it was a fashion phone, and it broke away from the flip phone mold. It had a 2-inch display with a 176 by 220 screen resolution. That's 141 pixels per inch for all you PPI patrollers. It had a 256,000 color TFT display. The camera was just a 1.3 megapixel camera with LED flash. It wasn't capable of video recording. It had 128 megabytes of built-in storage, an 800 milliamp hour battery with 200 hours of standby time and 6 hours of talk time. But it was the LG Prada that began LG's first in the mobile phone business. Announced in December of 2006, released in May of 2007. It was created in collaboration with Prada, who, if you guys don't know, is an Italian fashion and design company. The LG Prada KE850 was the first ever capacitive touchscreen phone, and it beat the iPhone by a few months. When it was released, it won an Industry Forum Design Award and a Red Dot Design Award, and it sold 1 million units in the first 8 months. Here are some of the specs on the Prada. It had an AMD Imagion 2282 media processor. It came with 8 megabytes of RAM, 256 megabytes of storage with micro SD card expansion. It had an 800 milliamp hour battery that was removable with a standby time of 300 hours and a talk time of up to 3 hours. It had a 3-inch full capacitive display with a resolution of 240 by 400 pixels. That's 155 pixels per inch. And it was a 256,000 color display. Not as much as iPhone 16 million color display, and this will be a reoccurring thing at first. The Prada had a 2 megapixel camera with autofocus, capable of 1600 by 1200 pixels photographs, and it could record video at 240 by 400 resolution at 30 frames per second. It didn't have a headphone jack, but it did have USB 2.0, and back then it was a pretty thin phone at 12 millimeters thick with the slate design, and it had LG's Flash UI. The next innovative phone from LG was released in August of 2007, and that was the LG Viewty. It was a 2G phone, and its main selling point was that it's the first touchscreen smartphone with a powerful camera. It had a 5 megapixel rear camera with a Schneider Kreuznach optics. And Schneider Kreuznach is a renowned manufacturer of industrial and photographic optics for cameras. It had a built-in xenon flash, and it was one of the first cameras with an ISO 800 for better night shots and optical image stabilization with autofocus. It could also do slow-mo video recording at 320 by 240 pixels at 120 frames per second, and then normal video recording at 640 by 480 pixels at 30 frames per second. There are no specifications on a CPU or chipset, so I'm assuming it's probably the same at that time for most feature phones, and that was the AMD Imagion 2282 processor, but that's just assumptions. The Viewty also had a 3-inch 256K display with a resolution of 240 by 400. Again, that's 155 pixels per inch. It had 8 megabytes of RAM, 100 megabits of storage with expandable memory via SD card slot. It too also had Wi-Fi 802.11b, Bluetooth 2.0, and FM radio, and it had a removable 1000 milliampere battery, good for a standby of up to 430 hours, and a talk time of up to 4 hours. In 5 weeks, the Viewty sold over 300 units in Europe alone. A UK retailer even suggested that it outpaced the iPhone. However, it was never made available in the United States, which limited its impact. Starting to see a pattern here? Following in the footsteps of the LG Viewty, LG released the LG Renoir KC910 in November of 2008. It was the first full touchscreen phone with the powerful 8 megapixel camera and the slimmest for its time at 14 millimeters. It had an ARM 9 CPU running at 140 Hz. It came with LG's Flash UI. No specifications on RAM, but I'm guessing 8 megabytes. It had 100 megabytes of storage with that SD card expansion slot. It had a removable 1000 milliamp hour battery with a standby of 264 hours and a talk time of 3 hours. It also had a 3-inch TFT 256K color display at 240 by 400 pixels, again 155 pixels per inch. Again, the camera was an 8 megapixel Schneider Kreuznach optics with xenon flash. It could do video recording at 480p at 30 frames per second, 320p at 120 frames per second. It had Wi-Fi 802.11b, Bluetooth 2.0. It had GPS. It had the FM radio. That's almost standard in LG phones, and USB 2.0. In December of 2008, LG released the LG Cookie. It was a budget alternative to more expensive smartphones, particularly Windows phones, and it had a removable stylus. Take that, Galaxy Notes. Although it was only a resistive touchscreen and not a capacitive touchscreen, it also did not include Wi-Fi, and no GPS. But it was really cheap at the time, at a price of just under or at $200, and it became a bestseller. It sold 2 million units in 5 months and 5 million units in 9 months. And again, that was with limited sales. That's the pattern that we're seeing, limited. The specs of the LG Cookie had an ARM 9E CPU running at 175 megahertz. It had a 3-inch 240 by 400 display, again 155 pixels per inch, and it was a TFT display with 256K colors. No specifications on RAM, but it had built-in 48 megabytes of storage with SD card slot. It had a 3.15 megapixel camera, no flash, no autofocus. It could video record at 320 pixels at 12 frames per second. Again, it had no Wi-Fi and no GPS, but it did have Bluetooth 2.1 with A2DP, and it had a 900 milliampere battery of up to 350 hours of standby and up to 3 hours and 30 minutes of talk time. The LG Arena KM900 was released in April of 2009, and it was the first smartphone with the quote-unquote Retina display, a display with at least 300 pixels or more per inch, beating out the iPhone by about a year. It had a 3-inch TFT screen with 256K colors, at a resolution of 480 by 800 megapixels, so that is 311 pixels per inch for all you pixel peepers. It supported multitasking when the iPhone could not. It had a multi-touch browser. It had Google Maps, but it didn't have voice guidance. And it also included Microsoft Office package. The LG Arena also had the LG's new S-Class Touch UI, which had like 3D graphics, including a 3D cube and a spinning menu. There's no mention of what kind of CPU it ran, but the camera was a 5 megapixel camera with autofocus, and again, the Schneider Krusnak optics with an LED flash. It could capture video at 480p at 30 frames per second. The Arena also had Wi-Fi 802.11bg, Bluetooth 2.0 with A2DP, and FM radio. Again, the GPS, USB 2.0. It included a removable 1000 milliamp hour battery with the 300 hour of standby time and a talk time of 3 hours and 50 minutes. The LG Arena was marketed as the ultimate multimedia phone, and its S-Class Touch UI was doing things that would not be seen until later on, way later on in Android, like like multi-touch gestures, 3D, a 3D cube, and even widgets. Widgets way before Android ever came out with widgets. The Arena could also record videos at 640 by 480p at 120 frames per second, and it was one of the first phones to record in DVD resolution at 720 by 480p at 30 frames per second. The LG BL40, or the new chocolate, released September 2009, is the first phone you could say that had an ultra-wide display, or the ultra-wide 21 by 9 aspect ratio. It had a 4.01 inch screen, 345 by 800 resolution, or 217 pixels per inch for all you pixel peepers. No mention of the CPU and RAM, but it had a pretty large storage for its day, with 1.1 gigabytes of storage with SD card expansion. The new chocolate had a 5 megapixel camera with autofocus and the Schneider Krusnak optics with LED flash, and it could capture video at 480p at 30 frames per second. The new chocolate also featured the same S-Class 3D user interface that debuted with the LG Arena. It has Wi-Fi 802.11b and G with DLNA. It had GPS, FM radio, USB 2.0, and Bluetooth 2.1. It came with a 1000 milliamp hour removable battery, good for up to 400 hours of standby in 2G and 370 hours at 3G, and then a talk time of 6 hours at 2G and 5 hours at 3G. In November of 2009, LG released their first ever Android smartphone in the LG GW620, also known as the LG Eve or the LG Touch Max. It was similar to the first Android handset, the T-Mobile G1, with the slide-out keyboard. It released with Android Cupcake, and at the end of its cycle, it had 2.2 Froyo. It came with the Qualcomm MSM 7200A ARM11 processor running at 528 MHz. It had a 3-inch 320 by 480 screen. That's 192 pixels per inch for all you PPI patrollers. It has 256K of colors, and it was a full capacitive touchscreen with multi-touch. The camera was a 5 megapixel with LED flash and was able to record videos at 320p at 30 frames per second. It also had Wi-Fi 802.11bg, Bluetooth 2.0, GPS with Google navigation, USB 2.0. It had a removable 1500 milliamp hour battery, up to 6 hours at 2G of talk time, 5 hours at 3G at standby time. It had up to 600 hours of standby time in 2G, 500 hours in 3G, a talk time of 8 hours in 2G, and 7 hours and 40 minutes at 3G. In June 2010, LG released its second Android phone, and that was the LG Optimus. It was released with Android 1.6 Donut, and at the end of its cycle, it got upgraded to 2.1 Android 2.1 Eclair. The Optimus was the more budget-friendly Android smartphone marketed to first-time smartphone and Android users. LG ditched the keyboard, and this was also its first Android Slate phone. The LG Optimus came with the Qualcomm MSM 7227 running at 600 MHz with an Adreno 200 Imagion GPU. It had 256 megabytes or megabits of RAM, and the internal storage was 512 megabits with SD card expansion. It had a 3-inch TFT 256K screen with the resolution of 320 by 480. That's 192 pixels per inch. It came with a 3.15 megapixel camera with autofocus that was able to record video at 480p at 17 frames per second. The Optimus also had your usual Wi-Fi 802.11bg, Bluetooth 2.1. It had GPS, again, LG is famous for the FM radio, and it was one of the first with micro USB. It also had a 1500 milliamp hour removable battery with 500 hours of talk time, with 500 hours of standby time at 2G, and it had a talk time of 5 hours and 30 minutes at 2G, 7 hours and 20 minutes at 3G. The LG Optimus 2X, released in February of 2011, was, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, the world's first smartphone with a dual-core processor. It was powered by an NVIDIA Tegra 2 chipset, and LG claims it's also the first phone to record in 1080p at 24 frames per second, but in reality, probably a little less. It launched with Android 2.2 Froyo, and by the end of its cycle, it was updated to 4.0 Ice Cream Sandwich. The LG Optimus 2X was supposed to promise gaming on your smartphone, with NVIDIA giving support with the Unreal Engine 3 for games like Doom 3 and Battlefield Bad Company, but that never came to fruition. You can't blame it on LG, probably more by NVIDIA and the game developers. The specs, again, it had an NVIDIA Tegra 2 clocked at 1 to 1.2 gigahertz, and it also even had a micro HDMI port. The screen was a 4-inch IPS 480 by 800 resolution, and that was 233 ppi. It had 512 megabytes of RAM and 8 gigabytes of storage with micro SD card expansion. The Optimus 2X also had an 8 megapixel camera with autofocus and LED flash, and like they said, it was able to record video at 1080p at 24 frames per second, 720p at 30 frames per second, and it also was one of the first phones with a selfie camera with the 1.3 megapixel shooter. For connectivity, it had all the usual Wi-Fi 802.11b, G, and N with DLNA hotspot, Bluetooth 2.1, it had GPS, again, what LG's famous for, the FM radio, and it also had micro USB 2.0. The Optimus 2X came with a 1500 milliamp hour removable battery with a standby time of 400 hours and a talk time of 7 hours and 50 minutes. Following on the first of the LG Optimus 2X, LG released the LG Optimus 4X HD in June of 2012. It was released with Android 4.0, Ice Cream Sandwich, and upgraded up to Android 4.1.2 Jelly Bean, although there were some unofficial versions with even Android 4.4.2 KitKat. The LG Optimus 4X HD was one of the first phones to have a quad-core processor, along with the HTC One X and the Samsung Galaxy S3. As one of the first phones to feature the NVIDIA Tegra 3 chipset, with 4 physical cores running at 1.5 GHz and even a lower powered 5th core running at 500 MHz for less demanding tasks and when the phone is at idle. Tegra 3 also integrated a 12-core GPU. Specs for the LG Optimus 4X HD were as follows. Tegra 3 chipset with integrated 12-core GPU cores, 1 GB of RAM, 16 GB of storage with SD card expansion. It had a 4-inch display with a resolution of 1280 by 720. That's 312 pixels per inch, and a 16 by 9 aspect ratio. One of the first phones to have that. Its rear camera was an 8 megapixel with autofocus and LED flash and optical image stabilization, capable of video recording at 1080p at 30 frames per second. It also had a front camera at 1.3 megapixels, capable of recording 720p video, although it doesn't say how many frames per second on the front. For connectivity, the Optimus 4X also had Wi-Fi 802.11a, B, G, and N, dual band Wi-Fi Direct DLNA with Wi-Fi hotspot. It had Bluetooth 4.0 with A2DP, Bluetooth Light Energy, LE, GPS. It had NFC, FM stereo, micro USB 2.0 with MHL TV out, and yes, it had a headphone jack. The Optimus 4X included a 2150 milliamp hour removable battery with up to 730 hours of standby time in 2G and 686 hours at 3G. It had a talk time of up to 9 hours and 20 minutes at 2G and 10 hours and 50 minutes at 3G. In November of 2012, LG released their first of their G series of phones, and that was the LG Optimus G. It launched with Android 4.1.2 Ice Cream Sandwich and was upgraded to 4.4.2 KitKat at the end of its cycle. It was one of the first of the G series, as mentioned, with the later G series dropping the Optimus name. The Optimus G was one of LG's first big sellers in Android, reaching 1 million units in 4 months after it was launched. The LG Optimus G is also the basis for the Google Nexus 4. It was one of the first phones to be released with Snapdragon S4 chipset, which is a quad-core chipset running at 1.5 GHz with the Adreno 320 GPU. It had 2 GB of RAM, 16 or 32 GB of storage with or without SD card expansion, depending on the region. The LG Optimus G had a 4.7-inch IPS display with a resolution of 1280 by 768, 16 million colors, 318 ppi, and has an aspect ratio of 5.3 with Corning Gorilla Glass 2. The rear cameras was a 13 megapixel or 8 megapixel depending on your region, with autofocus and LED flash, capable of video capture at 1080p at 30 frames per second. It also had a front camera at 1.3 megapixels, capable of 720p video recording. For connectivity, you have your usual Wi-Fi 802.11 A, B, G, N, dual band Wi-Fi Direct DLNA, and hotspot capability. It also had Bluetooth 4.0 with A2DP FM stereo radio, and again a headphone jack. It also had GPS with GLONASS, which means just faster GPS connectivity. It also had micro USB 2.0 with MHL TV out and USB OTG or USB on the go. It had a 2100 milliamp hour, again depending on the region, removable or non-removable battery with up to 456 hours of standby time at 2G, 411 hours of standby time at 3G, up to 15 hours of talk time at 2G, and 13 hours of talk time at 3G. Also released in November of 2012, almost right after the LG Optimus G, was the Google Nexus 4. It launched with Android 4.2 Jelly Bean and was upgraded to Android 5.1 Lollipop at the end of its cycle. The Google Nexus 4, as you may be able to tell, was the fourth Google Nexus phone, but the previous three were made by Samsung. The Nexus series of phones by Google were marketed as flagship specs at a bargain price. They were the predecessors of OnePlus phones today. As with all Nexus phones, they were mostly sold unlocked at the Google Play Store, but they were also sold in carriers, mostly GSM carriers, as the Google Nexus 4 was not LTE enabled, so that would mean T-Mobile and AT&T if you were in the United States. Jelly Bean was the Android operating system that featured widgets. Almost 3 years after LG launched the LG Arena in 2009 with the S-Class Touch UI that also had widgets. Specs for the Google Nexus 4 is just like the LG Optimus G. It had a Qualcomm Snapdragon S4 quad-core processor at 1.5 GHz with the Adreno 320 GPU. It also had 1 GB of RAM, 8 or 16 GB of ROM with no SD card expansion. It had a 4.7-inch IPS display with the resolution of 1280 by 768. That's 318 pixels per inch. The rear camera had 8 megapixel with optical image stabilization, autofocus, and LED flash with video recording capabilities of 1080p at 30 frames per second. The front camera was a 1.3 megapixel with video recording capability at 720p. For connectivity, it had Wi-Fi 802.11a, B, G, and N, Wi-Fi Direct with DLNA. It had Bluetooth 4.0 with A2DP, NFC, and something called Qi wireless charging. It also had micro USB 2.0. The Google Nexus 4 came with the 2100 mAh battery, again non-removable, with up to 390 hours of standby time, and it was 3G only, and up to 15 hours of talk time, 3G only. In September of 2013, LG released the LG G2. It launched with Android 4.2.2 Jelly Bean and was upgraded up to Android 5.02 Lollipop. This was one of LG's best-selling phones, exceeding LG's expectations. Remember, it was released in September of 2013, and by late December, it had already sold 3 million units. And this is all despite having a non-removable battery and no SD card expansion, except for the Korean version. The G2 was LG's first Android smartphone with the power and volume buttons switched to the back of the phone. It was also one of the first phones, along with the HTC Deluxe or Droid DNA, with the 1080p True HD screen. First LG phone to also feature Knock On, which is a double tap to turn the screen on and off, and with voice commands, like on the camera with the cheese shutter and everything. Specs for the LG G2, it had a Snapdragon 800 quad-core chipset running at 2.2 GHz and the Adreno 330 GPU. It had 2 GB of RAM, and you can get it with 16 or 32 GB of ROM. And again, no SD card expansion except for the Korean version. It had a 5.2-inch IPS True HD display with 16 million colors, a resolution of 1920 by 1080p, 424 pixels per inch, and it had Gorilla Glass 2. The cameras on the G2 was a 13 megapixel at the rear with autofocus, optical image stabilization, LED flash, and it also had HDR capabilities. It could record at 1080p at 60 frames per second with HDR and stereo recording. The front camera was a 2.1 megapixel camera with video recording of 1080p at 30 frames per second. For connectivity, it had Wi-Fi 802.11a, B, G, N, and AC, dual band, Wi-Fi Direct, DLNA, and hotspot capabilities. It also had the GPS with GLONASS, NFC, Bluetooth 4.0 with A2DP, LE, and aptX. This is one of LG's first phones with a 3.5mm headphone jack that had 24-bit 192 kHz audio. It also had micro USB with OTG, and again, it had a 3000 non-removable battery with up to 790 hours of standby time at 2G, 900 hours of standby time at 3G, a talk time of up to 6 hours and 30 minutes at 2G, 17 hours and 30 minutes at 3G. Oh, and it also had something called an IR blaster. You guys remember when Android flagship phones had one of those? Following the G2, Google once again called upon the help of LG to make the Nexus 5, released in October of 2013. It was launched with Android 4.4 Ice Cream Sandwich and was upgraded to Android 6.0 Marshmallow. The main highlights of the Nexus 5 is that it had a hardware similar to the G2, and it was largely successful for Google mainly because of the cost to performance ratio. The Nexus 5 succeeded the Nexus 4 and was followed shortly by the Nexus 6P and the Nexus 5X. So what type of specs did the Nexus 5 have? Same as the G2, pretty much. It had the Snapdragon 800 quad-core processor at 2.3 GHz with the Adreno 330. The Nexus 5 came in two variations, one with 2 gigs of RAM and 16 gigabytes of storage, or 2 gigs of RAM and 32 gigabytes of storage. Again, being a Google device, no SD card expansion. Also, being a Google device, it had a non-removable 2300 milliamp hour battery with Qi wireless charging, but no quick charge. The battery was good for up to 300 hours at 3G on standby and up to 17 hours at 3G of talk time. The Nexus 5 also had a true HD IPS Plus 4.95-inch display at 1920 by 1080. That's 445 pixels per inch with a 16 by 9 aspect ratio and Corning Gorilla Glass 3. It had an 8 megapixel f2.4 autofocus camera with optical image stabilization, LED flash, can capture panorama and HDR stills. It can record at 1080p at 30 frames per second. It also had a 1.3 megapixel selfie camera, f2.4, and doesn't say what the video recording capability was. Again, the Nexus 5 was largely successful even with limited availability. Usually you could only buy it through the Google Play Store, but because of its cost, $349 for the 16 gigabyte version and $399 for the 32 gigabyte version, it was $300 less than most flagships of the day, with most flagships averaging at $699. In November of 2013, LG released another innovation, the LG G Flex. It was the first phone with a flexible curved screen. The screen was a P OLED display. It also had a self-healing rear cover that healed itself from minor scratches and abrasions. The G Flex was met with mixed reviews. It was praised for its durability, but criticized for its lower resolution P OLED display, no micro SD slot, and non-replaceable battery. It had a Snapdragon 800 quad-core chipset or processor running at 2.26 GHz with the Adreno 330. It had 2 gigabytes of RAM and 32 gigabytes of storage, non-expandable. The criticized display was a 6-inch P OLED, but it was a true RGB 16 million color OLED, but again the resolution was only 1280 by 720, giving it a 245 pixels per inch and had a 16 by 9 aspect ratio with Gorilla Glass 3. The camera was a 13 megapixel with autofocus, had LED flash, and it was HDR and panorama still capability. Could record video at 1080p at 60. And then it had a front selfie camera that was 2.1 megapixel, capable of also recording at 1080p but at 30 frames per second. The G Flex for connectivity had Wi-Fi 802.11a, B, G, and AC. It was dual band, Wi-Fi direct, DLNA hotspot. It had GPS with GLONASS, Bluetooth 4.0 with A2DP, LE, aptX, and it had a headphone jack. The non-removable battery was 3500 mAh battery with up to 720 hours of standby time and up to 15 hours of talk time on 3G. Oh yeah, another knock on the G Flex was that it had no IR blaster, and because it was a first as far as with the curved display, it was very expensive at the time. With LG releasing 3 phones from 2013, the G2, the Nexus 5, and the G Flex, in 2014 they only released one phone, or one flagship, and that was the LG G3, released in June of 2014. It launched with Android 4.4.2 KitKat and was upgraded to 6.0 Marshmallow. The LG G3 was another first though for LG. It was one of the first phones with a 1440p Quad HD display. The first phone with the Quad HD display was actually a Vivo X Plate released in December of 2013. But this is all about LG. So, this was another bestseller for LG, selling 10 million units in the first 11 months. The G3 was outfitted with a Snapdragon 801 quad-core processor, clocked at 2.5 GHz with an Adreno 330 GPU. The G3 came in 2 variants, one with 2 gigs of RAM and 16 gigabytes of storage, or 3 gigabytes of RAM and 32 gigabytes of storage. Both had SD card expansion capabilities. The display of the G3 was a true Quad HD IPS 5.5-inch display with a resolution of 2560 by 1440, which gave it a super high 538 pixels per inch, and it had a 16 by 9 aspect ratio with Gorilla Glass 3. The camera on the G3, the rear camera, 13 megapixel, and it was the first camera with laser autofocus. And believe it or not, originally laser autofocus was developed for LG's robotic vacuums. It also had optical image stabilization with PDAF, which is phase detection autofocus. It could record videos at 4K at 30 frames per second, 1080p at 30 frames per second, with HDR and stereo sound. The front selfie camera was a 2.1 megapixel camera that could record video at 1080p at 30 frames per second. Connectivity on the LG G3 was Wi-Fi 802.11a, B, G, N, AC, dual band, Wi-Fi direct, DLNA with hotspot capabilities. It had Bluetooth 4.0 with A2DP, Bluetooth Lite, aptX. It had a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack with 24-bit 192 kilohertz audio playback. It had GPS with GLONASS, micro USB 2.0 with USB OTG on the go. It had NFC, and it came with a 3000 milliamp hour removable battery that was Qi wireless charging capable. It also had an IR blaster. The battery life for the LG G3 was 565 hours on 2G, 553 hours on 3G. For standby time, for talk time, it had 19 hours on 2G, 21 hours at 3G. If 2014 was a slow year for LG as far as smartphones were concerned, in 2015 they released 4 new handsets, starting with the G Flex 2 on January 2015. The G Flex 2 launched with Android 5.0.1 Lollipop and was upgraded to 6.0.1 Marshmallow. The G Flex 2 addressed some of the shortcomings of the G Flex 1. It was more compact at 5.5 inches of screen versus 6-inch screen. The 5.5-inch screen was also higher resolution, 1080p versus 720p. and had an improved self-healing back. The negatives on the G2 though were, once again, it was very expensive because of those innovative features. And for a premium expensive phone, it was missing some of the premium or nice to have features of more affordable phones, like stereo speakers, no IP rating, and no wireless charging. It also had, on some of the units, because of the Snapdragon 810, which was a hot running chipset, some overheating issues. Okay, let's go over the specs. Snapdragon 810, the first 8 core processor from Qualcomm, at running at 2.0 gigahertz with the Adreno 430. The G Flex 2 came in two variants, one with 2 gigs of RAM and 16 gigabytes of storage, or 3 gigs of RAM and 32 gigabytes of storage, and this time it had micro SD card expansion also. The improved POLED display of the G Flex 2 was a 5.5 inch 1920 by 1080p, which was 403 pixels per inch, 16 by 9 aspect ratio, and Gorilla Glass 3. For the cameras, it had a 13 megapixel f2.4 with laser autofocus, optical image stabilization. It had dual LED flash, and it was capable of shooting in panorama and HDR. It could do video at 4K at 30, 1080p at 60 with HDR video and stereo sound. The front camera or selfie camera was a 2.1 megapixel, and it could record 1080p at 30 frames per second. The G Flex 2 also had noise cancelling microphones for better audio recording. For connectivity, it had Wi-Fi 802.11a, B, G, N, AC, dual band, Wi-Fi Direct, DLNA, and hotspot. For Bluetooth, it was Bluetooth 4.1 with A2DP, LE, aptX. It had a headphone jack with 24-bit audio. It had GPS with GLONASS, NFC, FM stereo, micro USB with USB OTG on the go, and USB 2.0 fast charge. The battery was a 3000 milliamp hour non-removable battery, again with quick charge 2.0 with 18 watt per hour quick charging. It had a standby time of 520 hours at 2G, 450 hours on 3G, and a talk time of 18 hours on 2G, 20 hours on 3G. The second LG manufactured phone in 2015 was the LG G4. It launched with Android 5.1.1 Lollipop and was upgraded up to Android 7.0 Nougat. The main features of the G4 was that it had a curved back with optional designer leather covers. It was also known for its quality cameras, both front and back cameras. It was also the first camera from LG to introduce manual mode photo. The chipset wasn't top notch. Due to the overheating issues with the Snapdragon 810 chipset, LG outfitted the G4 with the lower end Snapdragon 808 chipset, which wasn't the top end chipset at the time, but it was being sold as if it had high end specs. The G4 also had no IP rating and no quick charger included out of the box. So here are the specs of the G4. Snapdragon 808, 6 core, Adreno 418. It came with 6 gigabytes of RAM and 32 gigabytes of storage with micro SD card expansion. The G4 had a 5.5 inch IPS Quad HD display, 2540 by 1440 at 538 ppi, 16 by 9 aspect ratio, Gorilla Glass 3. Its quality cameras, it had a 16 megapixel f1.8 with laser autofocus and 3-axis OIS, optical image stabilization. It also had LED flash, and it could shoot in panorama and HDR. Video recording at 4K at 30 frames per second, 1080p at 30 frames per second. It could record HDR video with stereo sound. The front camera or selfie camera was an 8 megapixel camera, f2.0, and it too could also record at 1080p for 30 frames per second. Connectivity, Wi-Fi 802.11a, B, G, N, AC, dual band, Wi-Fi Direct, DLNA, hotspot capabilities. It had a GPS with GLONASS, NFC, IR blaster, optional Qi wireless charging, FM stereo. It had a headphone jack with 24-bit 192 kilohertz audio playback. It came with the 3000 milliamp hour battery, removable, and the battery had up to 360 hours of standby time at 2G, 440 hours at 3G, talk time of 19 hours at 2G, 20 hours at 3G. The G4, along with the next phone in this video, was also famous or infamous for its known hardware issues like the boot loop problems and releasing their phones with that boot loop with the known boot loop issue. Okay, so that is it for part 1. Stay tuned for part 2 coming really soon, guys. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Follow me on Instagram at The Workout Geek for all my latest happenings and great workout tips. Till next time, everybody, take care and have a wonderful day.